Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience while we worked out a little technical issue. We're happy that you're joining us this evening. I'm Betsy Fisher Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. And welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. Whether you're watching on Crowdcast or Facebook Live, we are glad that you could join us tonight. For those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs. And we aim to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training and facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and policy. So tonight, we want to look a little more closely at women in foreign policy and national security with the former ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Jane Harman. She has just written a terrific new book called Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. So she is going to take us inside some of the major national security debates of our post 9/11 world and share her political experiences during her 9 terms in Congress and the decade she spent leading the nonpartisan Wilson Center as its first female president and CEO. Before we start, I'm going to let everybody know that we are going to take some questions. So please don't be shy. Type in a question that you may have in the Ask the Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can also upvote other people's questions there as well. And if you do miss any of the discussion or want to share it with friends, a replay will be available at the same link that you used to register. So with that, Congresswoman Harman, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. My profuse apologies to all. We did set this up earlier. I just couldn't get back in this thing.
No worries. We all know about technical issues these days. So we're just glad that you persevered with us. Thank you.
Do we have 15 extra minutes or do we stop on time?
We can go a little bit longer, as long as you can.
Well, I'm operating on fumes. I don't know about anybody else, but the Zoom life means there is no life.
I know, and your book just came out like yesterday, right? Was the pub date?
Yeah, yesterday.
So I know you're busy, so thanks for spending some time with us. Tell us about this title, because you have a funny kind of backstory of how you settled on Insanity Defense as the title.
Well, I had been thinking about writing a book since I left Congress. I didn't want it to be the story of my life. I wanted it to be a policy memoir, and it took a while to get my act together. And there was a precipitating event, it's in the book, which was that I debated a proposition at the Oxford Union. Oxford University has a black tie debating society. And the proposition I debated was the war on terror has not made us safer. And when I was first asked to take that side of the proposition, I said, no, that's not true. It has made us safer. But then I decided I wasn't given the option of debating against the proposition. So, going to Oxford and going to this amazing, the best debating society on the planet is too cool. I'm going to try this. And as I got into the topic, I ended up agreeing with it. And of course, my side won. But the point is, after that, thought that's basically the title of my book. The War on Terror has not made us safer. And I was telling my youngest daughter, who is a writer, I have 4 children, about the book and that this was my title. And she said, Mother, that's so boring. You should call it Insanity Defense. And all of a sudden, oh my God, I would never have thought of it. Everyone is asking me. And that's the basic point, that we keep doing the same things and expecting a different response. And guess what? We don't get a different response.
Well, I want to go through with you some of the big themes that you raised in the book, but I thought first maybe we would start on some of your personal story. I know you say you didn't want to write a book about yourself, but you have such an interesting background. And I think for women that are interested in national security and foreign policy, hearing a little bit about how you came into politics would be interesting. So can you share a little bit about your story and coming to Washington and working on the Hill and then deciding to run for Congress?
Happy to do that. I grew up in Los Angeles, which is where my congressional district was. And as a high school student, went to the Democratic Convention in LA, when security was not tight, with my boyfriend, got on the floor of the convention, saw John Kennedy nominated for president, which was an electric moment, met Eleanor Roosevelt, I'm not making it up, and was an usher at the LA Coliseum when he gave his acceptance speech. And it was just my personal epiphany. I loved politics. I still do. And I decided that that's somehow the kind of career I wanted. And I pursued it through college. I spent summers in Washington. After law school, I came to Washington. I then did a couple other things for a few years, but I worked in the U.S. Senate as a counsel, one of the first women to, just maybe on one hand, the number of women, to a U.S. Senator from California named John Tunney. I then worked in the Carter White House, and then after that, practiced law and tried to pursue my dream of finding a way to run for Congress, which came about in 1992, when a good friend of mine who had held the seat, which included where I grew up, decided to leave and to run for the Senate, which he lost to Barbara Boxer. And so I ran for an open seat. It was very complicated because at that point I had been based in Washington. I had two almost college-age kids and two young kids, and basically we moved our family to LA. So I was called a carpetbagger, which wasn't an unfair hit, but I did grow up there and I had enormous ties there. Anyway, it's a more complicated story if you want to hear it, but running for an open seat is easier. However, the seat, when I decided to run for it, was a safe Democratic seat. I am a Democrat. And after the lines were redrawn, this was the 10-year census redrawn seats, it became a lean Republican seat. And there were 5 Democrats and 7 Republicans in the race. What helped me were 2 things. Number one, my politics are very progressive on social issues, but they are centrist on defense and economic issues. So that was kind of a good fit, certainly better than the other Democrats. And in the Republican Party, one of the candidates of the 7 was Maureen Reagan, the daughter of Ronald Reagan, whom he was strongly supporting, and she was pro-choice. And I think everyone thinks that had she won her primary, she would have beaten me, because a pro-choice Republican in a lean Republican seat in 1992, which ended up being called the Year of the Woman.
Right.
This was a motivating issue. It would probably have beat me, but she lost. And she lost to a female candidate who was anti-choice. And all of her supporters came on over and became Republicans for Harmon. And I also, this district is the Aerospace Center of California. I knew a lot about defense, and I was able to persuade aerospace executives, senior aerospace executives who were Republican, to support me. And so I had this wedge, and I won, trying to remember, by 6 points, which was pretty substantial.
We had talked to Karen Tumulty last Wednesday about her new biography of Nancy Reagan. So that's a funny story about Maureen Reagan, and really sort of, those Republicans for Harmon connection through. But you write that you were a new Democrat. What do you mean by that?
Well, Bill Clinton was elected to the presidency the year I was elected to Congress. He was a new Democrat. This was a group in the Democratic Party that were pretty centrist on the issues I've talked about. I think they were also progressive on social issues. I called myself at the time a Scoop Jackson Democrat. Scoop Jackson had been or was still alive then, but a senator from Washington State with those politics, and very well known in defense circles. In fact, he was called Mr. Boeing. Boeing was based is still in Washington. Well, I know I actually moved, but Boeing production is still in Washington. And he was just a giant in the Senate on defense issues. At any rate, Bill Clinton was a new Democrat, and that group still exists in the House. And I also later joined another group called Blue Dogs, which is a kind of different group. It's mostly Southern Democrats, who, again, were for budget responsibility, a balanced budget. We disagreed strongly on social issues, but we agreed on fiscal responsibility.
And then you left Congress to run for governor in 1998, and had a very difficult primary and you got a lot of money spent against you.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience, deciding to leave, run for a higher office, and then ultimately coming back into Congress.
Well, in order to run for governor, I had to give up my congressional seat. Why did I do that? Because Newt Gingrich was the leader of the House. Politics were pretty rugged. In fact, when I lost the governorship, my Jane won. Jane Part 1 ended in December of 1998, and that was when we voted on the impeachment of Bill Clinton. It was a tumultuous period. I voted against the impeachment of Bill Clinton, but my point is that the governor job was very interesting to me. California at that time, I thought, could use a woman governor. It hadn't happened. Dianne Feinstein was in that race. She was in the Senate, and she dropped out at the last minute, and her support system came to support me. So it was a pretty crazy idea as I look back on it, but no guts, no glory. And so I ran, and it was a three-way primary. And one of the opponents in the primary had already hired the campaign consultant I had used in all my congressional races, a man named Bob Shrum.
Oh, yeah.
And the third candidate's name was Gray Davis. And I entered the primary 12 weeks before the primary election. So I had a lot of catch up to do to get known in California. So for 6 weeks, I ran positive ads. I grew up in this house. I went to this school. My vision for California is that. And after 6 weeks in the primary, I was number one in the polls. At which point, Al Checkey targeted me only with $42 million. This is 1998, probably $72 billion by now. And it was rough. I mean, a lot of the votes I made were twisted, and in the end, it was called a murder-suicide. I came in third, I think, with 12%. Checkey got 13%, and Gray Davis got 18%. He wasn't targeted, so he won the primary, and he won the election. But shortly thereafter, he was recalled by California voters and replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I was out of Congress for 2 years.
Yeah, for a term, and then you were persuaded to make a run again for your seat.
Yes, well, actually, a great thing happened when I was out of Congress, which is that Dick Gephardt asked me to serve on the National Commission on Terrorism, which was a vehicle, one of 3 studies of whether there could be a serious attack on U.S. soil. And ours took the most global look. It was an excellent group of people. And we predicted there'd be a major attack on U.S. soil. We testified and so forth. And in the middle of this, I got persuaded to run for my old seat, which had been won by a moderate Republican. Surprise, it was a Republican seat. And to run against him. And I hesitated, but I love politics, and I finally got persuaded. And so I ran, and I was promised my seniority back in Congress as a condition of running. That was a good thing I asked for and got. And I beat him by 1 point. It was a very tough race in 2000. Gephardt had hoped that we would take the House back, the Democrats would. But we only beat 4 incumbents, and we were far short. One of the other people who won for the first time in that race was the other Californian to beat an incumbent was Adam Schiff, who has gone on to great heights and now serves as chair of the House Intelligence Committee.
Well, you also write about, the fact that when as you mentioned, you kept your seniority, so you were able to then become the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee.
I was, yes.
But you write very frankly about your relationship with Nancy Pelosi and how, of course, you wanted to, when Dems took back over Congress, become the chairwoman of that committee. But she had a different idea.
Well, it's a little more complicated. Nancy Pelosi and I were and are friends. She was a big part of supporting me the first time I ran for Congress. She supported me for governor. She was deputy head to Dick Gephardt of recruiting me to run again for my seat. And I always supported her for leadership, and I raised money for her. What happened was she was senior to me on the House Intelligence Committee. The then ranking member, Julian Dixon from California, died suddenly. It was a very tragic thing. She was in the chairs for leadership, and normally leaders don't take senior positions in chairing committees. But she briefly was the ranking member on the committee. She turned that over to me. I had been promised that I would, in writing, that I would chair the committee. You know, we thought we were taking the House back, but this was the closest thing. So I did get that. And then when the Democrats took the House back in 2006, she could have, this is in the book, made me the chairman because it's a leadership appointment.
Right.
She didn't. And, it was a big disappointment at the time. I write that. It was a strain on our relationship for a time. But as I now understand it, and I write about this, she was trying to become speaker.
Mm-hmm.
She was representing a diverse coalition, which she does now too, in the caucus. And I had made, we can discuss this, I had voted for the Iraq War. I believed the intelligence. It's a long, funny story with my late husband who thought it was a lot of crap and couldn't believe I was going to do it. But anyway, I did that. And there was a stigma that attached to that
Right.
in the House. And I think that her move, and I say this in the book, was mostly based on trying to keep the caucus happy. So I didn't get that job, but what I did become was chair of the Intelligence Subcommittee of the Homeland Security Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And half the world thinks I still chaired the Intelligence Committee. I did, and segue to now, Nancy Pelosi and I are good friends, and we see each other and consult each other, and it's the way it should be, and it's the way it was. And I have a lot of respect for the speaker that she is, and think she will go down in history as one of the greats. Or maybe she'll stay there for 100 years and outwit all the historians because she outlived them.
Well, you also talk in your book about, the importance of, this cadre of women in supporting each other. Obviously, you had a policy difference with Nancy Pelosi, but there are other women that you work very closely with, even on a bipartisan basis. And you talk about your relationship with Susan Collins, Republican senator from Maine, and how important that's been. And then you all were able to work on legislation together. Talk about that experience, about being a woman and a leader in Congress, and the camaraderie you have with and support network that you have with other women there.
Okay, well, let me be clear that Nancy Pelosi and I had a difference on chairing the committee, but
Right.
we have a lot of differences, and we have a strong relationship, so I don't want anyone to misunderstand that. But I say that Harry Truman famously said that if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. And I actually had a dog when my kids were growing up, but the dog died. So I have better friends than that dog was. I hope I'm not offending dog lovers, but it turns out, certainly in Congress, that the women members are good friends, and the women's caucuses in both the Senate and the House are bipartisan. I don't know the status of the women's caucus in the House right now because of all the horror going on in the Republican Party there. But in the Senate, I am aware that the Women's Caucus has a weekly dinner, and it's not a huge number of people. I guess it's about a quarter of the Senate, so it's 25 people. And they get along together, they work together. An example right now in the Senate is this bill to set up a system outside the military chain of command for sexual harassment claims.
Right.
They have been dismissed and diminished by senior officers for years, and it is the idea of several women in the Senate to set up a different system, and it's getting traction. And the women are Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a quite liberal senator from New York State, and Joni Ernst, who is a quite conservative member from the Midwest, and they're working closely together on this thing, and that's why it's got traction. And that's the kind of relationship I'm talking about. And Susan Collins and I bonded over intelligence reform. That's what we did after the two gigantic intel failures, one on 9/11 and one on Iraq, WMD. Turned out there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Of course, I was fooled. But my husband, Sidney Harmon, who said, that's a lot of crap, when I told him I was going to vote for the Iraq War, wasn't fooled.
And so what lessons have come out of that, that vote and then that whole era in terms of national security? Because you delve into that into the book about things that we need to be more aware of and lessons we can take from intelligence failures.
Right. Well, to back up, the book starts with the end of the Cold War. And I was in the first post-Cold War class in Congress in 1992. We didn't have a strategy following the Cold War. We, the U.S., and not Jane in particular, although I don't know that I had one, said, we won, Russia lost, the whole world wants to be us. We can downsize the procurement budgets for defense and intelligence and declare a peace dividend and focus on other issues, which is what we did. And the first thing that happened was downsizing those budgets was devastating for my aerospace district because there was, triple PhDs were laid off. I came up with a strategy for that, which we could discuss. But that's one thing we did. The second thing we did is we missed the rise of China because we thought China wants to be us. Well, oops, China didn't want to be us. China has a very different system of government and economic view. And so we missed that. And the third thing, we missed the rise of terrorism. There was a bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. There were bombings of our embassies and two embassies in Africa in 1998. And we noticed that it happened, but we didn't think it was going to be something bigger. And as I mentioned, I was on this National Commission on Terrorism after I was in between my Congress chapters. And we predicted a major attack on U.S. soil, and Congress didn't pay attention. So that happened. Then what happens? We respond appropriately against those who attacked us, but we continue the military mission in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq, and then elsewhere. And we used military tools for foreign policy when we should have used, in more cases, soft power tools, diplomacy, aid, and even things like support in the case of disaster relief. Our military can do that mission very well, logistical support. And I'm hoping they'll do that now and get vaccines and arms everywhere in the world, which would be a huge good thing we could do to persuade the world that U.S. leadership is back.
You mentioned Afghanistan, so I wanted to ask you about President Biden's announcement recently about the complete withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of 9/11 this fall, and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton coming out and saying that there's a risk if that happens, that the Taliban, could reemerge. And, when we talk about women and women being protected in Afghanistan, how do we safeguard the gains that women have made in the Afghan society to ensure that women's rights are protected? And wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I support what President Biden is doing. And, oh, by the way, President Trump was the first guy to say we need to get the troops out of Afghanistan. He wanted to do it on May 1st. Biden has extended that and put in place a much better process to safeguard our troops and to surge diplomacy instead of the military as a way, hopefully, with the help of Turkey and others, to broker some kind of a compromise, which Trump was trying to do, so that the Taliban is in the government and the violence stops. Now, will that be successful? I don't know. But my point is insanity defense. We've been trying for 2 decades to make Afghanistan safe. And it hasn't happened. The Taliban right now, even with our troops there, is attacking girls in school. I'm very worried about the plight of women and girls. Of course I am. And but I talked to personally, in fact, I interviewed them, I think at the Wilson Center, several of the women on the the Taliban negotiating team who are confident that women have made enough gains so that they will hopefully, and they're recognized on this team, change the future. Am I saying this is a good option to get our troops out of Afghanistan? I am not saying that. I am saying it's the least bad option. And if we don't do it now, we'll never do it. And I don't see that as a proper use of the U.S. Military to basically prop up the government of one country and pick that country over others. It is true that we went into that country, but we achieved our mission quite quickly. We degraded those who attacked us on 9/11, Al-Qaeda, and we actually decapitated their leader in the Obama administration some years later.
Talk a little bit about the intelligence community and this notion of it becoming too politicized in some ways, and the reforms that were put in place after 9/11, reformatting Homeland Security, bringing in a director of national intelligence. How do you see all of that having played out, and what is your sense of, and especially coming now after the Trump administration, do we see intelligence politicized? What are your thoughts on that?
The intelligence story is uneven.
Yeah.
Uneven from basically its founding. In World War II, there was I'm trying to think of the name of it, can't think of his name. Anyway, there was an intelligence type service, but it was in 1947.
Oh, the OSS?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Wild Bill Donovan.
Yeah.
Who he was. But thank you. But it was in 1947 when in the National Security Act that we set up the modern Pentagon, which has since been revised some. And we set up the intelligence community, which included the CIA as the manager of the community.
Right.
There was a community management service, a small group of people attached to the CIA. Okay, so mixed results over the years, but Congress got in the game and passed after some abuses in the Nixon administration, created intelligence committees in the House and Senate and passed something called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which has been the basic law for all the years since.
Right.
Didn't work perfectly, never worked perfectly, but after 9/11, huge intelligence failure, and after the intelligence failure of wrongly predicting that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, some of us set out to reform the Intelligence Committee structure, and that is when we set up the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The DNI is a new creation to coordinate across intelligence agencies. There are 16 of them. And that has worked better until the Trump administration, when efforts were made to remove senior personnel and put in leadership that was very political, which is not the goal. Our intelligence community is supposed to speak truth to power.
Right.
It doesn't make policy. It gives policymakers the most accurate picture possible, not perfect, of the intentions and capabilities of others around the world. Some are our friends and some are our enemies. But if you're trying to understand, let's just say Israel-Palestine or whatever you're trying to understand, you want a good picture of who the leaders are and what they might do.
Talk a little bit about the importance of bipartisanship, and you alluded to this just a little bit earlier when we were talking about Susan Collins, but the bipartisanship that existed sort of during those days on the intelligence committees, and then what you see as, in current political climate, the fact that, bipartisanship is a lot of times not rewarded at the ballot box. And that we've become so polarized, and we have kind of extremes on both sides in primaries coming.
Yes, well, I think there's a slippery slope. It's a legal term.
Yeah.
We're sliding down, and we are now at a toxic place. And basically, the business model of Congress is to blame the other side for not solving the problem. Because if you work with the other side, you are bipartisan.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes you a target in your primary. Somebody from the far left or the far right is likely to oppose you as being bipartisan, which, the turnout in primaries is low, and the people who turn out are the most vocal, and usually they have views that are less centrist than other people. So there's always a risk if you do that, if you work with others, that you're going to be a target and you might lose your primary. And sadly, too many people are putting getting reelected ahead of the country. And I want to give a shout out to Liz Cheney this week.
Mm-hmm.
This week?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah.
Last week, who did a very courageous thing and obviously paid with her leadership position and may pay with her seat because she's in a very, very Republican state, in a very, very Republican district, and a lot of people may run against her to punish her for insisting that we ought to tell the truth about the last election.
And you write in the book about your interactions with her father, Vice President Dick Cheney, when he was in Congress.
Not when he was in Congress. I met him when I was first elected to Congress, and he told me that serving in Congress is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I will be, what a big honor it is and all that. And the irony of that is when he was vice president, although he had served in Congress, he basically disregarded Congress. He's the one who
he didn't want to do the briefings, right?
The unitary executive theory.
Yeah.
Giving the president much power.
Right.
And consulting Congress much less.
We do have a couple of questions. Let me get to a few of these. Here's a question from Isabel. She says, what sparked your interest in national security?
Well, I loved foreign policy. I always did. And after I graduated law school, I spent actually a year in high school in Europe, and I spent a year after law school in Europe, and I worked for several international organizations in Geneva, Switzerland, and I was always interested in it. I then practiced law for 10 minutes in an international law firm. And then I went to work, as I mentioned, for this California senator where I focused domestically. But segue to working for him, then Jimmy Carter. Then, before I went back to practice law, I was special counsel to the Defense Department. How did that happen? I knew somebody and I was interested to see what it would be like. I learned more about defense. And when I was elected to Congress, I represented the Aerospace Center of California, and it was logical to seek seats on the defense committees. I wanted to get on Intel because, as I mentioned, my district made most of our intelligence satellites, but there was only one slot, and so the person more senior to me was selected, and her name is Nancy Pelosi. So she got on the committee in 1992. It took me until 1997 to get on it, but I was on armed services, science, which has a lot to do with space, and NASA, fascinating issues. And I just learned more and more and more. And I love the issues. And, back in the day, very few women. Now, women had aerospace firms. Women are all over the place. And why shouldn't we be? We're qualified and we're knowledgeable.
Well, along those same lines, here's another question about national security being a boys' club, right? And the question is, what advice do you have for young women hoping to focus their careers on national security and foreign affairs?
I don't think it's a boys' club anymore. I just mentioned that women have headed and still head some of the major aerospace firms. Mm-hmm. Women have senior positions on defense committees in the Congress. And certainly, think back to 2004, two women, Susan Collins and I, were two of the four designers of the intelligence reform law. I always used to say that since we were the two women, we did 98% of the work. And we became dear friends. And which doesn't mean I agree with everything she does or that she agrees with everything I do. But the support system, mutual support system we developed was a big deal.
Let's see. Here's a question from Caitlin. She says, you mentioned the lack of a plan following the Cold War. What do you foresee as the U.S.'s role in a post-COVID world?
Okay, well, good, very good question. I think Joe Biden has a foreign and defense policy strategy, which his four predecessors did not have. None of them had experience in foreign affairs. Let's start with Bill Clinton, who was a brilliant governor of Arkansas before he was president. Let's move along to Bush 41, who basically gave the foreign policy file to Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney, yeah.
How that turned out. Let's move on to Obama, who had no foreign policy experience. I mean, he had an interesting heritage. His father was African, and he lived in Indonesia for a bit. But there's nothing that I know of, in his pre-Senate days that shows a keen interest in foreign policy. And then let's move to Donald Trump, and I don't think I need to say anything about that. So here comes Joe Biden with an extensive resume in Congress, chaired the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, traveled to 110 countries, knows all the foreign leaders. Really different deal, and has put the A team in place. I'm very bullish on people he's picked in the foreign policy area, especially Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. And so he's different. His interim national security strategy, understand that last word, strategy, is all about, the shorthand for me is taking the foreign out of foreign policy and making our engagements in the world include three things that they haven't really before. One is the pandemic. You said post-COVID world. I hope there will be a post-COVID world. I mean, this damn thing keeps morphing, and it sure isn't cured around the world, and I'm still worried about it. So pandemic, climate. Climate's a huge issue, not just domestically, and it's a national security issue. Think of migration, and think of failed and failing states and how terrorists are recruited there.
Right.
Destabilizers in the world. And then his third one is domestic terrorism, and there's a huge rise of that, and that's fueled by, the sort of dark side of globalization, the dark side of the internet, the dark side of social media in general. And a lot of those folks are not foreign terrorists. They are not.
Well, you also write in the last chapter of the book about lessons from this post-pandemic era and how government competence and capacity still matter, and we've seen that play out.
We have certainly seen that play out, and with respect to the pandemic itself,
yeah,
there were planning exercises. This is not the only pandemic, or at least it's the biggest one and the most lethal one, but we've seen this movie many times in the last 2 decades, and there were stockpile that was empty, oops. There were planning exercises that were ignored, a playbook for how to do this. And then there was denial. Oh, this isn't so serious. It'll go away by summer and yada, yada. And we also let China off the hook to some extent for failing to disclose adequately the origin of this. And so this got geometrically worse. And the lack of competence in planning in the Trump administration created a catastrophe. And I give Biden high marks. It's not over, but many of us are vaccinated. Even 2 of my grandchildren are now vaccinated. They're over 5. And I just don't want us to forget that this thing is still with us. I also don't want to forget those and to forget to honor those who died. And I'm serious about. It may be a post-COVID world, as in this particular pandemic, but I don't think it's a post-pandemic world that we're in.
Right. Here's a question from Sydney. She said, back to the Iraq War vote we were just talking about. When you voted in favor of the Iraq War, to what extent did public pressure play a role in your decision?
Well, it's interesting. The vote, Nancy Pelosi voted no, obviously.
Yeah.
A number of Democrats voted no. It was a certainly a plurality of Congress voted for it, but it wasn't like the vote to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, which was near unanimous.
Right.
Member of Congress voted no. I voted for it because I did my homework. That's in the book. I read everything. I traveled everywhere, and the people I talked to were persuaded that there really was a risk. First of all, persuaded that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and a serious risk that he could use them on us, especially chemical weapons, which would be smuggled into our country. And I believed it, and so that's why I voted for it. And there were many at the time, in addition to my husband, who thought I was nuts. So I didn't see it as, I mean, there is constituent pressure, no question, for lots of things. But I kind of prided myself all my years on trying to put the country first. And I explained my votes, even if they were unpopular. And it worked out pretty well for me. I never lost a congressional election.
Mm-hmm. You did spend a lot of time in the book talking about various commissions, and then of course the 9/11 commission and the success of that. And I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on sort of the news today, with McConnell coming out opposed to a commission to look into the January 6th insurrection, and get your thoughts on, what should be done about that, and if you think a commission is warranted, and what good can come about. Sometimes you write this in the book too, our solution for everything is a commission or a task force, but there are times when there is, good that comes out of the commission finding.
Well, I served on the National Commission on Terrorism.
Right.
We were a really good commission, and we made right-on recommendations. 9/11 Commission, which was co-chaired by my predecessor at the Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton,
right,
who was a former member of Congress and a mentor to me, was spectacular.
Yeah.
It was created by a substantially bipartisan vote. This was a while ago. The muscle memory is lost. And it was widely supported in the country. And it was very thorough, and most of its recommendations were adopted and helpful. Mm-hmm. And I'm a strong fan of a 1/6 commission modeled after the 9/11 commission. I think it's on life support. Very sadly, a whole bunch of members of Congress don't want to know what happened, and not only don't want to know what happened, but also don't want to know how to prevent it from happening again. And certainly the news is reporting that Kevin McCarthy, who first encouraged John Katko, ranking member on House Homeland Security Committee, to work with Ben Thompson, chairman, in crafting a bill, which they did. He first encouraged him, changed his mind, reportedly, because the commission would have subpoena power, which is proper, and Kevin McCarthy might have to testify under oath about the conversation he had with Donald Trump while the insurrection was going on. And so he decided that would not be okay, changed his mind, and the House was thrown into an uproar. I don't know, I should know, but I've had the Zoom day from hell, whether the vote occurred today. Did it occur in the House?
I don't know. I just heard this afternoon McConnell's speech where he came out against against the commission.
So that will encourage many House members to vote no.
Yeah.
They plan to vote yes. Interestingly, the so-called Problem Solvers Caucus, which is
Caitlin just says in the chat, it just passed the House, she said. So late breaking news.
How many Republican votes were there?
I don't know. Caitlin, how many Republican votes?
Come on, Caitlin, let's hear.
Tell us.
How many votes?
Live news feed here on our chat. While Caitlin is looking that up, Julie has a question about what is your biggest worry for the U.S. in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, surprisingly, I never thought I would feel this way, is vulnerability from within. I mean, this whole effort to change voting practices in states so that elected legislators can overturn the certification of elections and the certification of electors can make it possible in a very political race to undermine the votes of the people. And also other state laws that make it harder to vote, whether it's in person or by absentee, also undermine the votes of the people by preventing them. And we have had a very resilient democracy for all our years. We've made mistakes, and it is absolutely fair to say that minority voters have been first disenfranchised and then later semi-enfranchised. But we were making great strides. And I think the so-called big lie is a real threat to America's future.
I don't want to end on a negative note, so let me ask you a question about some positive things. Of who are you impressed with today when you think of young women in politics, young female members in the House, and kind of the future that you see for women in politics?
Well, I think I'm just trying to think among many, and some are not as young as others, but a very good friend of mine who I think has a long future, even though she is not young, that young, she's younger than I am, is Karen Bass of California, who was the head of the Congressional Black Caucus. She's termed out of that, but she's the leader in this voting rights bill.
And was certainly speculated about as being a VP pick too, right?
She was. She was considered for that.
Mm-hmm.
And she may be a future senator from California. I don't know, but I think she's fabulous and has all the gifts. There is a woman, trying to think of, I can think of lots of members, so I don't.
Well, and there's also a lot of women now that have sort of come together, sort of, and that have former experience in intelligence, former CIA officers, Alyssa Slotkin, and sort of that Abigail Spanberger
is a great example. She is, she's not, she had a reasonably long intelligence career. She had 3 or 4 deployments in Iraq as an intelligence person, not as a military person. She's smart as a whip, and she serves on all the right committees, and she's pretty fearless, and she adds a level of expertise in the defense and intelligence space that very few do, male or female. And I'm a huge fan of hers. There are just lots of good women, and lots to choose from. And a difference is there isn't just the token woman on a committee.
Yeah.
Chair committees. The chair of the House Appropriations Committee is Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. And lots of women chair the probe subcommittees, which are very powerful positions. And we haven't had a woman chair of the House Intelligence Committee yet.
Right.
We could have, but we didn't. But we have had one in the Senate, Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah. Well, Congresswoman, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. The book is terrific. Anybody who wants to order a copy, there's a link on the screen to order. And we really appreciate you sharing your insights and persevering on the technical issues with us at the beginning. And it's always great to see you. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you all, and thanks for hanging in. I am not totally clueless digitally, but there was some glitch that was way beyond my control.
Well, I'm glad we got it figured out, and always great to see you, and good luck on the book tour.
And good luck to anyone who's studying at AU. It's a very good school headed by a woman.
Yay. Thank you, Congresswoman. Good night, everybody.